Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Professor John Deni from U.S. Army War College. Hello, Professor.
Hello, Jacek.
Okay. Since I introduced you as a professor, I hope you don't mind that I will be, addressing you, John, just like you, Jacek, especially that we know each other from prior to the war when Strategy and Future visited U.S. Army War College with our new model Army. So my first question is, how do you see the battlefield in Ukraine in terms of the, first of all, through strategic lenses of European security architecture, and then through more operational lenses, how do you view the evolution of the battlefield itself? So what is making either of the sides winning or losing in the operational art?
Well, Jacek, thanks so much for inviting me to chat with you. First, I should note, because I am a U.S. government employee, and yet we have academic freedom, the things I'm going to say are my views alone and not necessarily the views of my government or the Department of Defense. But I'm involved right now in a group project that's seeking to answer just this question: what explains Ukraine's success or failures on the battlefield relative to the Russians right now? It's a multi-author study involving several of us at the War College, but also colleagues at Columbia University and National Defense University. And we're trying to unpack this right now to see what lessons the U.S. Army, but also NATO more broadly, needs to take on as a result of the war. And I'll tell you, most broadly, I think it's fair to say that those of us, even those of us that have studied European security for years, decades, that are aware of the Russian military capabilities, of their modernization efforts over the last 20, 25 years or so, we've frankly been stunned by the outcome of the progress of the war to date. And namely, I think there was a conventional wisdom in my country and perhaps elsewhere in the West that the Russians, with their vast advantages in manpower, modern equipment, and technology, would have overwhelmed Kyiv's defenses. And we've been shocked that that hasn't happened. And I think there are a couple of significant factors that help us to explain that. Now, as I mentioned, this project that we're now engaged in is just underway the last few months. It'll unfold over the next few months. The war is, of course, not over. There are still twists and turns to unfold. So what I'm going to say are really preliminary findings or takeaways or conclusions. They're not really conclusions, but they're preliminary assessments. But it seems obvious that on the Russian side, Russia's either unwillingness or inability, not sure which, to follow its own doctrine at the outset of the war was a critical element in its inability to achieve the fall of Kyiv from the very beginning, right? And by that, I mean this sort of thrust, this stabbing effort toward Kyiv early on in the initial days and weeks. That does not follow, in our view, from what Russian doctrine would call for in a large-scale land.
Can you be more granular in exactly this phase of war, this maneuver warfare, maneuver on Kyiv? What went wrong? What was a shortcoming? What was not in accordance with the Russian doctrine? It's critically important. Let's focus on phase one of this war, maneuver warfare. Yeah, an attempt to seize Kyiv and make the shock and awe. I understand maneuver that was to completely debilitate the Kyiv government.
Yeah, it looked that initial stab toward Kyiv looked a lot to us in the West, especially Americans, like the so-called Thunder Run, which took place early in the war in 2003 in our war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And those who are familiar with that particular operation might recall that it was an armored or mechanized thrust from the outside of Baghdad into the middle of Baghdad, And it shocked the Iraqi defenders to such a degree that it sort of shattered their defenses in Baghdad and resulted in it contributed to a relatively quick fall of Baghdad's defenses and then of the Iraqi government, of Saddam Hussein's government. This looked a lot like that, but frankly, the Russians don't have this kind of operation as part of their doctrine. What they are more accustomed to pursuing are sort of rolling waves of artillery, which kind of pulverize the enemy as well as everything else within sight, including civilians and civilian infrastructure, followed then by waves of armor supported and protected by infantry. That didn't unfold in the early weeks. And as the Russians tried to implement that, it was obvious they didn't have the logistics to keep up with the mechanized forces moving forward. They didn't have the manpower to do it. And so they were using, for example, airborne troops in a way that they're not accustomed to being used to seize territory and terrain in the advance of this forward movement. And so there were all kinds of problems, a lot of it related to logistics that the Russians simply weren't able to overcome. And again, this is primarily
manpower and failing logistics that could serve still the front maneuver units in BTGs, yes? In Russian
exactly right. This explains why we saw Russian units columns arrayed along highways for days at a time.
What does it mean that there was a misplanning? That it's a planning issue, or cultural issue, or over ambitious political objective? What, just from the practical sort of craftsman's perspective, what's the essence of this? What was the essence of this mistake?
I think,
or maybe the actions of the Ukrainians that disseminated, that sectored them out, that stretched them out, that maybe the enemy had to say.
Yeah, I'm going to get to Ukraine's role in this in a moment, but speaking first about the Russian role, this is all again preliminary assessment, but my sense is that a lot of what explains the Russian inability to achieve success in what they were trying to do early on is tied to, frankly, the fact that Russian forces, Russian military culture does not embrace what we would call in the US the notion of mission command. That is a decentralized command structure or command philosophy where lower echelons of command, the company commanders, the battalion commanders, even the squad commanders, are empowered to make decisions on their own based upon the commander's broad intent. Okay. Now, what did that mean in this instance? Well, it meant specifically that Russian forces weren't still aren't very adept at adaptation on the fly. In the face of obstacles, in the face of unexpected resistance, they have a hard time adapting to that and adjusting.
Especially that the tempo of operation is much faster than even 10 years ago, given the internet loops, the revolution in information sharing and gathering, right? And the amorphic, as we say, command and control. That if you have the internet access and you have a lot of data that might be sucked into the internet loop and OODA loop, then the structure that is more flat is more responsive to the rapid changes on the battlefield. Yeah, while in the rigid situation, in the rigid echelon of line of command, it's so difficult to adjust, and the cultural issues also kick in as well, right? They follow.
Exactly right. The sort of the hierarchical nature of Russian military culture, reflecting to some degree the hierarchical nature of Russian society, right? All of these things sort of flow down from the broader society of which the military is a part. And so, these were critical, I think, explanatory variables when we try to examine how and why the Russians failed initially. It also explains, the flip side of this, is that this also explains in part Russia's success over the summer in steady but slow progress in Donbass. That is basically ejecting Ukrainian forces out of the remainder of Donetsk and Luhansk. So, but to get back to the second half of your earlier question about, well, what role did the Ukrainians play in all of this? I mean, clearly the impact of Western training and equipping of Ukraine since 2014 was seen on the battlefield. And by that, I mean not simply Western equipment, which has proven itself to be reliable and effective in the hands of Ukrainians, but the training and the almost indoctrination of Western approaches to the command philosophy, mission command, this sort of a thing, leadership philosophy. All of that has obviously been impactful for the Ukrainians and explains to some degree how they managed to exploit Russian mistakes, take advantage of opportunities that are presented on the battlefield, and achieve some significant successes over the past several months. First, beginning with the defense of Kyiv, and then now in recent months, taking advantage of Russian shifting of forces in the battlefield to leverage what have been really relatively thin Russian defenses in the Kharkiv region in the northeast.
Yeah, would you agree with the following observation from both of those phases of the war? Phase one, Kiev and maneuver, and some sort of a stoppage of this maneuver, warfare against action against Kiev, and the second, more steady advances of the Russian forces supported by the advantage in artillery. That phase one was dominated by the Ukrainian successful, Wilton Park project. People called it Uber operations. So, if you have OODA loop in control and you are faster in OODA loop than Russians, and still, so you can really try to oppose their maneuver by small squads, small units dispersed with lethal weaponry that wreak havoc on the logistical line. So it's like Uber. The guys here, another squad is here, the units here, use it as effectors, small units, like Uber guys, just driving the cars, okay? While in second phase with artillery, a lot of UAVs, drones, reconnaissance, modern scouting battle that is dominant on the battlefield, it's like a submarine warfare in a way that people hide and people seek each other. Yeah, maneuver is difficult. You need to really exploit the opportunity. What do you think about this? Just sort of a comparison, because there is why at Strategy and Future we think it's critically important, because it seems that if the sensors are the king of the battlefield, and because they enable long-range fires from beyond the line of sight, of course, and even beyond the line of horizon, then hiding is critically important. So finding people on the battlefield almost equals killing them or changing their intentions, and that is sort of, if there is an equal match between both parties, that is killing the maneuver. So it's getting more static. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think there's, we had this view in the West a couple of years ago that if you could be seen on the battlefield, you were as good as dead, right? Mm-hmm. I think we've seen some evidence of that in practice in Ukraine, but I don't think it has been decisive yet. And by that, I mean, we are entering, I think, a period of a little more static action on the battlefield, especially as we see Russian conscripts enter the theater. We can talk about that separately. I'm not convinced they'll make a significant impact in terms of Russian offensive operations, but I do think they will help to reinforce Russian defenses of the existing lines in Ukraine. But my point is, more broadly, the sensors are absolutely vital. We see both sides employing them to great effect, right? Using the sensors to spot the enemy and then delivering non-line of sight munitions, either through indirect fire or through drones, for example. But that hasn't yet proven decisive, at least in the current battlefields in the South and in the East. Whether it will, I think, remains to be seen. What we do know is in the battle for Kyiv early in the war, phase one, as you put it, it seemed very clear that not simply were the sensors important, but the terrain played an important role as well in enabling or facilitating the Ukrainians to operate in a disaggregated way, in a dispersed way, smaller teams, and really to take advantage of Russian mistakes. Those same tactics have not been as applicable in phase two, and maybe now what we're witnessing is phase three of the war. So, but I think your broader point is a good one, that sensors remain absolutely vital. And I think they explain a good deal of Ukraine's success in the second phase, although we've seen that second phase now kind of perhaps reflecting the immense success, right? Ukrainian forces being kind of exhausted to some degree with their offensive success. We've seen now that that has been pushed perhaps to its extent. And we might not see further movement, significant movement along the lines that we saw in the Northeast for another several months, maybe until the spring.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, and I hope that you will want to, you will feel like, sharing this opinion with me, but for sure at U.S. Army War College and, among American colleagues, you were thinking what the battlefield would look like, especially in the Russian Kiev attack with all those exposed long columns and so on, if the Ukrainians had the U.S. Army capabilities and, for example, helicopter attack, beyond the horizon fires, standoff ammunition, and so on. So did it look pathetic in terms of the power application on the Russian side if confronted with the modern Western U.S. Army in terms of the battlefield, or it's not easy to draw such conclusions?
We might be able to draw that conclusion. And the reason why I say might is getting back to the reasons for Ukrainian success and Russian failure so far to overthrow the government. One of the most important reasons that I haven't addressed yet is will. And I mean that both at the level of the leadership, but also at the level of the military forces. And this is, again, something that many of us were very surprised by in the West, namely Zelensky's willingness to stay in Kyiv, to resist, to rally his forces and his and the political elite, the military and the political elite of Ukraine in defense of their country. This was surprising, I think. You can never know how any leader is going to react under such a stressful situation. And Zelensky really rose to the challenge in a way that surprised many of us. At the same time, we see a Kremlin led by Vladimir Putin that has become increasingly personalist in its style. We sense that Putin is probably receiving poor intelligence. We know that most personalist dictatorships tend to sort of drink their own Kool-Aid. And that's, what I mean by that is there's an echo chamber within the leadership of these kinds of governments. Exactly right. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know whether or not Putin's getting good information, reliable information from those around him who will be inclined, as leaders are in these kinds of governments, to not tell truth to power. So we have a very different situation amongst the leaders. And then we look at the troops. It's very clear that Ukrainians have a stronger will, have stronger morale than the Russians, despite the immense casualties the Ukrainians are taking. Their morale remains very high. And the exact opposite is seen now on the part of the Russians. There's been some great reporting over the last couple of days by Reuters and Politico, among others, on some of the things that Ukrainian forces and others are uncovering in the aftermath of retreating Russian forces. The kind of documentary evidence showing really poor morale and the lack of a will to fight on the part of the Russians. So these kinds of factors have been absolutely critical. And so I think that as the fight continues to unfold, these intangibles will continue to play a vital role, as will the tangibles, right? The things that the West is providing, for example, to Ukraine. Now, to get to your question of whether or not the Russians are destined to fail in the face of a more capable foreign adversary, I think, again, a lot of this depends upon the will. If the Russians had been not the instigators of this attack, but rather the victims of it, let's imagine a world in which Ukraine was indeed the aggressor and attacked Russian territory. I think the case could be made that will might have played the exact opposite role in that situation. The Russians might have risen to the occasion, and even in the face of a Western-backed Ukrainian military, might have performed a bit better. We also know from the example of Syria that Russian forces, especially their air forces, have been and can be effective in certain kinds of environments. So I wouldn't yet say that the Russians are a paper tiger. I know that it's becoming very popular, very common in the West to view the Russians as kind of a spent force right now, to conclude that they're going to take at least the rest of this decade. Even if the war were to end tomorrow, the Russians will need the rest of this decade to rearm, retool, and rise up once again as the threat that we thought they were just 12 months ago. I'm not sure if that's quite accurate. The Russians still retain a number of important capabilities across numerous domains, including air, space, cyber, as well as sea. And we know they haven't used all of their capability in the land domain. That said, they're clearly on their heels. So, yeah, the Ukrainians have done a heck of a job so far, we must say, vis-a-vis the Russians, and it remains a surprise.
So, and what do you think about the mobilization effort, the mobilization that was announced by the Russian government? On Strategy and Future, we also prior to the war, we were thinking about our new model army, and now we find that this area of the mobilization, fierce mobilization, the 21st century, is greatly understudied all across the world. Of course, we can find a lot of texts and papers and books about the 20th century mobilization, but what do you think? Is it true that increasingly the current environment, civil environment, the current civil society, the current, the way the state operates these days and the society operates makes the mobilization effort a different feat that it used to be in the 20th century. And this is why the Russian effort will simply follow the 20th century method. After having broken it, by Serdyukov and Shoigu, actually, this fourth generation, whether the mechanism of first generation might be the same as in the 20th century, or it has to be in a completely different animal. What do you think?
I think using mass mobilization, even of so-called reservists, and we know from some evidence that's emerged that the Russians are calling up not merely reservists, but those that don't necessarily have significant military experience beyond their conscription requirement. This mass mobilization for the kind of operation the Russians are trying to engage in, that is namely a war of choice against a country that did not attack them. This, I think, is very difficult to pull off, politically speaking. But we know that given the limited training that some of the conscripts who have entered the fight so far have had, it's going to be difficult to pull off operationally. And that is, what I mean by that is it simply won't add much to Russian capabilities. I'm not sure that Putin, though, had much of a choice. I mean, we know that he sustained significant casualties, and we know also he's relying increasingly upon private military contractors like the Wagner Group. And this makes it increasingly difficult, I think, for Russian operations on the ground. And by that, I mean you have disparate groups with different capabilities within the Russian force, and this compounds their communication challenges, their logistical challenges. It makes this worse. And when you add poorly trained conscripts to that mix, again, I think it's a recipe for a poor or a weak operational outcome. I think Russian mobilization efforts would have been on much firmer ground had they, again, if the context were different. I think it's very difficult to mobilize Russian forces in the way they are attempting for a war of choice against an enemy that did not attack them. I think it's destined to fail, at least in terms of achieving offensive success on the battlefield. I think it could still have an impact in terms of Russia's defense of the current lines. And by that, if the Russian conscripts are used to fill out currently undermanned Russian units, and we know that Russian units right now have been reduced in their manpower by as much as 3/4 of what they're supposed to be on paper. If those conscripts are used to fill out those units, that may have the effect of adding some steel into the defensive efforts of the Russians right now.
Mm. Yeah, I think on top of that, there is a difference between the offensive and the defensive. As I was, taught in the offensive, usually you need to, especially in the elite units that are spearheading the offensive, you need to have the veterans, people of steel, people understand. Almost entire units should be composed of people that understand the warcraft because it's so demanding on them in an opening phase of the offensive. While in defense, if you put some veterans here and there, you can consolidate the and of course the planning is completely different. So the staffs don't need to be so big in defense. Yeah, sometimes it's even more democratic because people can contrive, figure out some, there might be some even consultations among ranks. And while in the offensive, you need to make decisions, prioritize, right? It has to be a more of the so just ballet, it's you really need to have a coordinated effort. What do you think about this observation from Ukraine? And that would explain why Ukrainians have faced tough issues with undertaking offensives.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. I don't want to give short shrift to defensive operations, right? I mean, if we look at, for example, U.S. doctrine, when it comes to offensive or defensive operations, I mean, they can both have a level of difficulty that may be unattainable by poorly trained conscripts. And here we see the role of junior leaders, mid-ranking leaders is vitally important, whether the operation is defensive or offensive. So I think we like to think that, sure, going on the offense requires, as you said, a greater familiarization with warcraft, but to some degree, defensive operations do as well. I don't think necessarily that the conscripts will be a serious weakness on the part of the Russians in this regard. I think instead, the fact that their leadership has been decimated is really the critical variable, whether the Russians are on offense or defense. Where I think the conscripts will make more of an impact on the defense is in simply providing more manpower on the front for the Ukrainians to try to work their way through. If again they're used to reinforce existing units that may still retain some of those junior officers or those more senior NCOs that can play a leadership role and have some battlefield experience. But like I said, we know that the Russian leadership ranks have been really decimated. And so the impact of these conscripts, even on defense, may be more limited than what I'm suggesting.
Interesting. You wrote a book about European security architecture, coalition of the willing or unwilling, yes? There is a trick with words. We are reading this book at Strategy&Future. We were advocating it in Poland. It was Poland. We do it again as I speak. Please, reading books is a great thing for all our listeners and viewers, and especially the book by my guest, Professor John Deni, very much worth reading. John, tell me, first of all, how your perspective has changed since the war broke out in that respect. And what is your opinion about the security architecture in Europe? And it sounds, of course, a very trivial question, but basically it's not, because I'm hearing very conflicting views about it. When I talk to the Germans, they see it completely different than when I talk to Poles, for example. And I have to admit, and it's for you to know, probably you know that in Poland we have a major revolution in seeing those things and the security architecture in Europe, let alone the position of Germany in France. There is a major disappointment with functioning of our Western continental allies and their failing capabilities even to help, even if there were a political will. So what would you say to what I have just said, and what are your comments to that?
Yeah, Jacek, thank you for mentioning my book. It's entitled Coalition of the Unwilling and Unable. It's a play on the phrase Coalition of the Willing and Able, right? Which became very popular in my country about 20 years ago as we were becoming involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the intent of the book was, it really flowed out of my last book, which was on NATO and Article 5, which looked at the alliance, broadly speaking, and examined what were the three major challenges the alliance faced in ends, ways, and means as it sought to re-embrace collective defense in the wake of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This second book, Coalition of the Unwilling and Unable, was an effort to unpack what was happening within some of the key allies of the United States in Europe. And I looked at 5 of them.
Including
the UK,
Poland.
Including Poland. UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland. And and this was a sort of an in-depth look at what these countries were planning in terms of their security investments, but what they were also capable of when it comes to the critical underlying factors of political military strength. And to me, I take kind of a neo-realist perspective on this. Population and the economy are critical here, okay? So when I looked across all of the allies, frankly, for someone who is a transatlanticist like myself, someone who sees great value in the role played by NATO like myself, it was a rather depressing book to write. And I say that because the main takeaway at the conclusion was that very few, if any, of these 5 major allies will, over the long run, have the capacity, capability, and will, the combination of those 3 things that would be needed as far as the United States is concerned for engaging in strategic competition with the Russians and the Chinese, but also dealing with the myriad of other threats that may arise that could distract us from that competition. I'm thinking of things like instability in the Middle East or economic dislocation in Africa, these kinds of things. When it comes to Poland in particular, it seemed to me that Poland really was turning its economic capability into some hard military power, and that was a welcome thing when it came to Washington's perspective. But I had serious doubts based upon the analyses of other experts on Poland's ability to have the economic wherewithal to see that plan through. In other words, a lot of the investments that the Polish government is making in the military are long-term security investments, right? Acquiring F-35s, for example, or now M1s, M1 tanks. A lot of these, or procuring and developing weapons domestically. A lot of these platforms take years to develop and then acquire, and then integrate into the military force, make them actually usable. That years-long trajectory requires serious, committed, long-term economic investment. And I was concerned that what we thought of as the Poland as the economic tiger of Eastern Europe or of Europe over the last 5 to 6 years, that was not going to remain the case. in the through the early to mid 2020s. And we've seen now with the impact of the pandemic that in fact growth rates are not as high as they were in Poland in the 2017, 2018 timeframe. So I have serious concerns about whether our allies will be able to muster what they need to defend themselves and to play the role that we hope they play in the alliance. And we've seen, frankly, we've seen evidence of that now. Just a month or so ago, was it Joseph Borrell, EU foreign minister, essentially said that European allies were running out of equipment and ammunition, largely because they were providing it to Ukraine. This is very worrisome in Washington. We are doing all that we can, as you know, to provide the Ukrainians with weaponry, ammunition, other equipment and material. But we need the Europeans to step up as well. And I know that Poland and Lithuania have played leading roles here. We look to them to hopefully continue in that vein, but we're also looking to the French and the Germans to step up and provide more. But as I mentioned, this is becoming very difficult because European stores, European stocks are being or have been depleted. And this is going to become a big problem over the next few years, not merely as we hope to continue helping the Ukrainians, but as we need to see our European allies replenish their stocks so that they can continue to defend themselves against a Russian adversary that remains unpredictable.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting, John. I hope I will convince you to make another recording very soon, since the war is still, going on. I hope that, next time around when we talk, we'll have a more positive picture of what's going on. And, in Poland, there is this feeling of war, which is very tangible. It's palpable.
Yeah.
We moved ammunition and material to Ukraine. I actually am based less than 250 kilometers from the border. Well,
oh, really?
That's a place in Warsaw from where I talk to you now. So there are, a lot of Ukrainians on the streets here that were absorbed by the Polish society. At construction sites in Warsaw, many men went back across the border to join the Ukrainian military because they were working in the Polish economy. I mean, this is a real thing. And also the Polish government is thinking that, first of all, the Polish government promised to spend even 5% of GDP on the military in the coming years. Of course, there is a question of how well it is spent, how, organizational culture is mature enough to really make it happen. But that's another story. The will is there. The resolve is there. And the society wants to feel the formidable force. Especially since we saw that our brethren Ukrainians defeated them at Kiev. I'm telling you, this is a moment similar to the Warsaw victory in 1920, and this is how we felt here. And since we see that they are beatable, now we unleashed, our resources to feel the force.
Yeah.
So we may talk about it next time. That was sort of a teaser. And I would very much welcome your remarks how we should structure our force. What do you think? What should we field? Both in terms of our own, the battlefield, the geography, but also how to realign it with the American sort of perspective of this conflict across Eurasia. So sort of fill in some gaps or to be a helping force to sustain the international system. But for the time being, thank you very much. Our guest today was Professor John Deni from U.S. Army War College. Thank you very much, Professor.
Jacek, it was really a pleasure. Thanks for asking, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks.